I am a ghost. Not the kind that haunts attics or rattles chains, but the kind created by a lawyer's pen and a family's greed. While I was risking my life in the dust of a private security contract 6,000 miles away, my own blood was burying me alive. They didn't just steal my money, they deleted my identity. But there's one thing about ghosts: we don't have anything left to lose. And I'm about to make their lives a living hell. Welcome to the Conflict Code. If you've ever been pushed to the edge by the people who were supposed to love you, you're in the right place. Today's story is a masterclass in why you should never count a man out until you've seen the body. Smash that like button and subscribe. Let's dive into the fallout. They say grief brings families together. In my family, grief was just a smokescreen for a heist. My name is Mark. For the last 5 years, my life has been measured in rotations, high-stress security details, and the dry, metallic taste of desert sand. I took the overseas contracts because the money was life-changing, and honestly, because being the youngest of 3 brothers meant I was always the one expected to make my own way. My brothers, Elias and Julian, stayed home in the suburbs, playing the roles of the dutiful sons while our father's health spiraled. My father was a self-made man. He built a logistics empire from a single truck and a lot of sleepless nights. By the time he passed, the estate wasn't just a house. It was a portfolio of commercial real estate, a fleet of vehicles, and a legacy. I was in a communication blackout when he died. I was deep in a gray zone escort mission when the lung cancer finally took him. By the time I got to his satellite phone and saw the 62 missed calls, he had been in the ground for 3 days. The flight home was the longest 18 hours of my life. I expected tears. I expected a somber reunion. I expected to sit in my father's study, drink his favorite bourbon with my brothers, and talk about the man who raised us. Instead, when I pulled my tactical duffel bag up the driveway of the family home, the locks were changed. I stood there, blinking in the humid afternoon heat, my key useless in the deadbolt. I knocked. Then I pounded. Finally, Julian opened the door. He didn't hug me. He didn't even step aside to let me in. He looked at me with a cold, glassy stare, the kind you give a telemarketer you're about to insult. "You shouldn't be here, Mark," he said. His voice was flat. "What are you talking about? I just got off a plane. I missed the funeral, Jules. I'm dying here. Let me in." "There's nothing for you here," he replied, and then he handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a stack of legal filings. My heart dropped into my stomach as I scanned the legalese. Petition for summary administration. Declaration of missing person. Presumption of death. They had filed an emergency petition with the probate court. Because I had been in a high-risk zone and unreachable for a period of months, and because my brothers provided testimony that I had expressed a desire to disappear and sever ties, they had convinced a local judge that I was likely deceased or, at the very least, legally incompetent to manage my affairs. "You're dead, Mark," Elias said, appearing behind Julian. He was wearing one of my father's gold watches. "The one Dad promised me for my 30th birthday. Legally speaking, you don't exist. We've already liquidated the liquid assets. The estate is settled." I felt a rush of heat crawl up my neck. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a coordinated strike. My own brothers had used my service to the family's financial future as a weapon to delete me from the family tree. "I'm standing right here," I yelled, slamming my hand against the doorframe. "I have my passport. I have my military ID, which are all being flagged as we speak," Elias said with a smirk. "We reported your identity as potentially compromised by hostile actors overseas. Good luck getting a bank to talk to you. Now, get off the property before we call the cops for trespassing." The door slammed. I stood on the porch of the house I grew up in, a ghost in a tactical vest, with nothing but a duffel bag and a burning, icy realization. My family hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They had tried to kill me without using a single bullet. I spent that first night in a cheap motel, paying cash because my credit cards were already restricted for suspicious activity. I lay on the thin mattress, staring at the popcorn ceiling, the silence of the room louder than any explosion I'd heard in the field. I realized then that my brothers had been planning this for years. They knew my contracts. They knew my blackout periods. They had groomed the family lawyer and likely greased a few palms to fast-track the missing person filing. They thought I was just a grunt, a hired gun, with no head for business or law. They thought I'd just roll over, take whatever crumbs they tossed me, or disappear back into the desert. But they forgot one thing about my job. I'm a specialist in threat assessment. And right now, they were the primary targets. As the sun began to rise, I realized my brothers had made a fatal mistake. They had left me with one single asset they deemed worthless, a key to a dusty, off-site storage unit filled with what they called Dad's junk. Little did they know, Dad didn't keep junk. He kept insurance. The next 72 hours were a descent into a bureaucratic hell I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Have you ever tried to prove you exist to a system that has already checked a box saying you don't? I went to my bank. The teller, a woman who used to recognize me, looked at her screen, then looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. Mr. Sterling, this account is flagged as part of a deceased estate. I can't even open the submenus. You need to speak to the estate executors. The executors? My brothers. I went to the police. They told me it was a civil matter. Since there was a court order from a probate judge, they couldn't intervene. Hire a lawyer, kid, the desk sergeant said, not even looking up from his coffee. But how do you hire a lawyer when your funds are frozen? How do you fight a legal war when you can't even rent a car because your license has been flagged for identity verification failure? I was living out of that motel, watching my cash reserves dwindle, feeling the walls close in. I reached out to old family friends, people who had known me since I was a boy. Most didn't pick up. The ones who did sounded uncomfortable, like they were talking to a criminal. Elias had been busy. He'd told everyone I'd gone rogue overseas, that I'd developed a substance problem and was trying to shake the family down for money. He'd poisoned the well before I even landed. The weight of it was crushing. I sat in that motel room, the smell of stale cigarettes and cleaning chemicals filling my lungs, and for the first time in my life, I felt true, paralyzing fear. Not the kind of fear you feel when a mortar lands nearby. That's adrenaline. This was the fear of being erased, of being a non-person. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. My eyes were bloodshot, my jaw set in a permanent clench. I was at my lowest point when I remembered the storage unit key. Julian had tossed it at me like he was throwing a bone to a stray dog. Dad's old records and personal effects are at the facility on 4th, he'd said. Take it and get out of our lives. I walked 3 miles to the facility. My boots felt like lead. I found Unit 402. It was a climate-controlled space, tucked in the back corner. When I slid the door up, the smell of my father's old pipe tobacco hit me so hard I had to lean against the corrugated metal wall. It was packed. Filing cabinets, old leather chairs, and crates of ledger books. My brothers saw this as a graveyard of a bygone era. They wanted digital assets, liquid cash, and modern real estate. They didn't want the paper mess Dad had accumulated over 40 years. I started digging. I spent 14 hours a day in that unit, using a battery-powered lantern after the facility lights timed out. I went through every ledger, every personal letter, every tax return from 1985 to the present. That's when I found it. Hidden in the false bottom of an old fireproof box was a ledger my father had kept separate from the business accounts. My father wasn't just a logistics man. He was a lender, a silent partner to dozens of local businesses. And as I turned the pages, my heart began to hammer against my ribs. Elias and Julian's successful, independent ventures, the tech startup Elias bragged about, and the luxury car dealership Julian managed, weren't funded by their brilliance. They were funded by massive, private loans from our father. Loans that were structured with aggressive, on-demand clauses. But there was something even better. My father had been meticulous. He had kept records of every favor he'd done for the local probate judges, the city council members, and the very lawyer who had helped my brothers declare me dead. I found a series of bank transfers, offshore to domestic, that didn't match the reported earnings of the family business. My brothers hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They had been embezzling from the company for years while Dad was sick, thinking he was too far gone to notice. But Dad had noticed. He had documented every cent they took, every forged signature, every misallocated font. He hadn't confronted them. Maybe he was too heartbroken. Maybe he was waiting for me to come home. At the very bottom of the box was a letter addressed to me, dated 3 weeks before he passed. Mark, it read, "Your brothers have a hunger that can't be satisfied. They see people as assets to be liquidated. If you're reading this, it means they've tried to move against you. Don't fight them with your fists, son. Fight them with the truth. Everything they own, it isn't theirs. It's mine. And now it's yours." The realization washed over me like ice water. I wasn't just a ghost. I was the beneficiary of a shadow empire. I took the documents to a man I knew from my security days, a fixer who specialized in forensic accounting and legal counterattacks. He owed me his life after a botched extraction in Herbal. "Mark," he said, looking over the ledgers in a dimly lit office. "You realize what you have here? Your brothers didn't just steal a house. They've been running a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. And these loans? They're past due. The interest alone would bankrupt them 10 times over. I don't just want them bankrupt," I whispered. "I want them to feel what I felt. I want them to look in the mirror and realize they don't exist anymore." The plan started to form. It wouldn't be a quick strike. It would be a slow, methodical dismantling. I needed to let them think they had won. I needed them to get comfortable. I needed them to spend every cent of that stolen liquid cash so that when I pulled the rug, there would be nothing left but the hard, cold floor. For the next 6 months, I stayed dead. I worked as a night shift janitor for cash, watching from the shadows as Elias bought a $5 million mansion and Julian expanded his dealership. They were throwing parties, celebrating their hard-earned wealth. They had no idea that I wasn't just watching, I was buying. Every debt, every lien, and every secret they had was being quietly moved into a single, anonymous holding company. My holding company. 6 months. That's how long it takes to dismantle a man's life when you have the blueprints to his foundation. While my brothers were busy being local titans of industry, I was living in a studio apartment that smelled like bleach and cheap ramen. But my walls weren't bare. They were covered in flowcharts. I had Julian's dealership inventory on one side and Elias's real estate holdings on the other. My fixer, Miller, was a ghost in the machine. Every week, he'd bring me a new piece of the puzzle. Julian just leveraged the dealership to buy a yacht, Miller told me one night, dropping a folder on my scarred wooden table. He used the family estate as collateral. He's overextended, Mark. One bad month, and the whole house of cards wobbles. Then let's give him a bad month, I said. The strategy was simple but lethal. Through the anonymous holding company we named Revenant Holdings, I began buying up the private debt my father had recorded in his hidden ledger. You see, when someone dies, their debts don't just vanish, they become assets of the estate. Because my brothers had declared me dead and unfit, they had technically assumed control of the estate's liabilities too. They just hadn't bothered to read the fine print in Dad's private books. I didn't just buy their business loans. I went after their personal vulnerabilities. I discovered that Elias's tech startup was actually a front for a massive tax evasion scheme involving offshore servers. He was using the family's logistics company to move physical hardware that didn't technically exist on paper. It was classic white-collar fraud. He thought he was a genius. I saw him as a man standing on a trapdoor, waiting for me to pull the lever. But the most delicate part of the plan wasn't the money. It was the resurrection. To take them down legally, I couldn't just walk into a police station. I needed a mountain of evidence that would make it impossible for their bot judge to look the other way. I spent weeks tracking down the doctor who had signed the mental instability affidavit my brothers used against me. I found him at a high-stakes poker game in an underground club. I didn't threaten him. I just sat down at the table, placed a copy of his forged medical license, which I'd found in Dad's blackmail files, next to his chips, and smiled. "I'm the ghost of Mark Sterling," I whispered, "and you're going to help me haunt my brothers, or you're going to spend the next 20 years in a federal cell." He crumbled in 10 minutes. He gave me a recorded confession detailing how Elias had paid him $50,000 to sign the papers without ever seeing me. With the doctor in my pocket, I moved to the next phase, the squeeze. I started small. A shipment of Julian's luxury cars was delayed at the port because of a sudden, anonymous tip about structural safety violations. The holding company he owed money to, my company, suddenly tripled the interest rate on his floor plan financing, citing a risk reassessment. Julian panicked. He did exactly what I knew he would. He went to Elias. Elias, I need a bridge loan. Julian pleaded over a tapped phone line Miller was monitoring. The bank is breathing down my neck. If I don't move these cars, I'm underwater. I can't help you, Jules, Elias snapped. The IRS is auditing the logistics company. Someone sent them a detailed map of our offshore routing. I'm tied up trying to keep the lawyers paid. I sat in my dark apartment, listening to their voices crack with a fear I knew all too well. It was the sound of the walls closing in, the sound of powerlessness. We should have made sure he was actually dead, Julian whimpered. Shut up, Elias hissed. He's gone. He's a nobody in a desert somewhere. This is just bad luck. We'll weather it. They didn't realize that bad luck was sitting 3 miles away, drinking a cold beer and checking the calendar. The climax was set for the 1-year anniversary of our father's death. They were planning a commemorative gala, a high society event to honor Dad's legacy, but really to rub their success in the faces of the local elite. It was the perfect stage. They wanted to celebrate a man they'd betrayed. Fine. I would give them a guest of honor they'd never forget. In the weeks leading up to the gala, I didn't just plan revenge. I lived in the gym. I regained the weight I'd lost. I shaved the drifter beard. I bought a suit that cost more than my motel room. I wasn't just coming back to claim a check. I was coming back to reclaim my soul. Miller asked me the night before, "Are you sure you want to go this far? You could just sue them and take the money." I looked at the photos of Elias and Julian on my wall. I thought about the locked door, the manila envelope, and the way they had tried to delete my very existence while I was halfway across the world. They didn't just take my money, Miller, I said. They took my name. Tomorrow, I'm taking it back. And I'm taking everything they built with it. The night of the gala arrived. The ballroom was filled with the sound of clinking champagne flutes and fake laughter. Elias stood at the podium, a glass raised, preparing to give a speech about family loyalty and legacy. He looked out at the crowd, smiling like a king. He didn't see the man in the back of the room. He didn't see the servers, my guys, quietly locking the exits. And he certainly didn't see the 3 federal agents standing by the coat check, waiting for my signal. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying stench of hypocrisy. Elias was mid-sentence, his voice booming with a rehearsed tremor of emotion. Our father always said that a man's name is his most valuable currency, he proclaimed, raising his crystal glass. And Julian and I have spent this past year ensuring the sterling name remains a beacon of integrity. I stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains at the back of the stage. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I simply walked toward the podium with the calm, measured pace of a man who had already won. The first person to see me was Julian, who was sitting at the front table. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. The sound cut through Elias's speech like a gunshot. Elias turned, annoyed at the interruption, and then he saw me. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, because, in his mind, he had. "Evening, brothers," I said, my voice amplified by the microphone Elias was still holding. The room went deathly silent. The socialites and business partners leaned in, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Mark," Elias stammered, his bravado evaporating into a thin, pathetic wheeze. You're supposed to be dead? Disappeared? Unfit." I finished for him. I took the microphone from his limp hand. "I'm sorry to ruin the party, but it turns out I'm remarkably hard to kill, and even harder to ignore." I turned to the audience. "I'm Mark Sterling. Most of you were told I passed away overseas. Some of you were told I was a drug addict who abandoned my father on his deathbed. Both were lies concocted by the men standing on this stage to facilitate the theft of a $40 million estate. Security." Julian screamed, finally finding his voice. "Get this man out of here. He's a trespasser. He's unstable." 2 security guards moved toward me, but they were stopped by 3 men in dark windbreakers who stepped out from the wings. The words Federal Bureau of Investigation were emblazoned in yellow on their backs. "Actually," I said, looking Julian dead in the eye, "I'm the owner of the building, and the owner of your dealership, and the owner of the debt that's about to put you both in a cage." I signaled to the tech booth. The giant projector screen behind us, which had been showing a slideshow of Dad's life, flickered and changed. It didn't show photos of the past. It showed bank statements. It showed the forged missing person affidavits. And finally, it played the video confession of the doctor who had helped them erase me. The room erupted. The whispers turned into roars of disbelief. I leaned in close to Elias, who was trembling so hard his teeth were chattering. "I bought your debt, Elias," I whispered, loud enough for only him to hear. "Every loan Dad gave you. I called them this morning. You're not just bankrupt. You're homeless. By tomorrow morning, the IRS will have the keys to your tech firm. And Julian, the cars at your dealership were seized an hour ago for being collateral on a fraudulent loan." The lead FBI agent stepped forward. "Elias Sterling, Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement." As the handcuffs clicked shut on their wrists, the kingly facade shattered. Julian started sobbing, begging me to listen, telling me it was all Elias's idea. Elias just stared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you've won?" Elias hissed as he was led away. "You have nothing. You're just a grunt." "I have my name," I said firmly. "And as of 5 minutes ago, you don't." The aftermath was a whirlwind. It took another year of legal battles to officially resurrect myself in the eyes of the government. I had to sue the state to overturn the death certificate, a process that felt like fighting a war with paper instead of lead. But I won. I took control of the Sterling estate. I didn't keep the mansion. I sold it and used the money to set up a foundation for veterans who have their identities stolen or their lives dismantled while serving overseas. My brothers? They're serving 8 to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. Without their money and their status, they are nothing. They are the ones who have been erased now. Sometimes, I go to the cemetery where my father is buried. I sit by his headstone and share a bourbon, just like I'd planned to do the day I came home. I told him I kept his insurance safe. I told him the Sterling name finally means what he wanted it to mean: resilience. I'm no longer a ghost. I'm the man who came back from the dead to make sure the truth stayed alive. Betrayal is a poison, but justice is the cure. Mark's brothers thought they could delete a human being for a paycheck, but they forgot that the strongest bonds aren't made of money. They're made of blood and honor. If you enjoyed this journey of ultimate vindication, make sure to hit that like button and comment "The Ghost Returns" below. It helps the channel more than you know. Until next time, stay sharp and watch your back. This is the Conflict Code.